Blizzard's coming, mister, and so is the man who wants you dead. Birdie Calloway warned the stranger who would become her husband by first thaw, though she had never, not once, sent for him at all. Rifle broken open over one arm, hair whipping loose from under her hat. Boots planted the way a woman plants herself when a piece of ground is hers and she means to keep it that way. Birdie looked less like a woman greeting a stranger than one laying down a warning. The man on the bottom step did not flinch. He only looked up at her with eyes that had already seen worse than a rifle, and held his silence, because there was nothing yet worth breaking it for. Behind him, the pass was closing. Behind him, somewhere down that white mountain road, 4 horses were already moving toward her gate, though neither of them knew it yet. That's where this one starts, and that's where I mean to bring you back to before I'm through. Stay with me a while, because this is a story about 2 people who were never looking for each other, and a woman who decided when it counted that some things are worth standing your ground for. It's a story about a mountain in Wyoming in the dead of an 1882 winter, about a cowgirl who buried a husband and kept a ranch alive on will alone, and about a man who rode up out of somebody else's lie to find the one place on earth that might finally believe him. There's a line I think of every time I tell a story, like this one, something the writer Laura Ingalls Wilder once put to paper, plain as anything: home is the nicest word there is. Birdie Calloway lived by that very creed, in fewer words and with a good deal more grit behind her teeth. Home wasn't a soft word to her. It was a debt she paid every single day, alone, until the day it stopped being lonely. Beatrice Calloway had been Birdie since she was 6 years old and too small for the saddle her father put her in anyway, and she had been alone on the Anvil Creek spread since the winter of 1879, when her husband, Daniel Calloway, went out after a stray heifer during a whiteout and never rode back down off the Teton bench. They found him in April, when the snow finally gave him up. Birdie did not talk about that April to anyone, not even to herself, not if she could help it. What she did instead was work. She worked the way some women pray, steady and wordless, and without expecting an answer back. She ran 400 head of cattle on 1,100 acres of high, hard country, with 2 hired hands, who came and went with the seasons, and a foreman, old Ezekiel Combs, who had known her father and stayed on out of something between loyalty and pity, though Birdie never let him get away with the pity part for long. She could rope a calf from a dead run, rake a green horse before breakfast, and read a coming storm off the color of the sky the way other folks read a newspaper. She had shoulders that could set a fence post in frozen ground, and a face that had been once before the wind and the work took the softness out of it, the kind of pretty that turned heads at the Jackson Church socials. She still turned heads. She had simply stopped noticing, or stopped letting herself. Grief does that to a person. It doesn't always look like weeping. Sometimes it looks like a woman who rises before dawn and rides until dark because the alternative is sitting still long enough to feel the size of the house around her. Anvil Creek had a wide porch, a good stone chimney, and 3 empty chairs. Birdie had gotten very good, over 3 winters, at not looking at the other 2. Her neighbors down in the valley loved her and worried over her in roughly equal measure, and none more than Opal Mabry, who ran the mercantile and post depot in the little township below the pass, and considered herself, by long tradition and no one's actual invitation, the keeper of every unmarried heart in 3 counties. Opal had watched Birdie Calloway hitch her wagon alone, haul her own feed alone, doctor her own stock alone for 3 winters running, and it had gotten under Opal's skin the way a splinter does, small and constant and impossible to leave be. A woman was not built to carry a mountain by herself, Opal liked to say, usually to whoever was standing nearest the flour barrel, and usually with Birdie nowhere in earshot to argue the point. Birdie would have argued it plenty. Birdie was carrying that mountain just fine, thank you, and had the calluses to prove it. 1,200 miles south and east of that mountain, in the hill country outside San Antonio, a different kind of storm had been building for a good deal longer than one Wyoming winter, and it wore the name of a man named Emmett Shaw. Emmett had grown up the son of a saddler in a town too small to matter to anyone who didn't live there, and by the time he was 20, he had hired on as a hand for the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, the Vance Cattle Company, run by a man named Colonel Ezra Vance, who had made his fortune buying up small ranches from families who could not pay their note and had never once, in Emmett's hearing, allowed it any name but good business. Emmett was not the kind of man who talked much, but he was the kind men trusted with the things that mattered, and within 6 years he had risen to foreman of the Vance home range, answerable to no one but the colonel himself. He was good at the work. He loved the land, if not the man who owned it, and he had a particular gift, with green horses and grieving cattle and frightened men, a patience that seemed to come from somewhere deep and unspoken, the way some men are simply built quiet and careful and do not know how to be otherwise. The trouble started on a crossing at Willow Ford in the spring of 1881, when the colonel ordered 1,100 head pushed across a river running high and fast off a late thaw against Emmett's word that the ice shelf on the far bank had gone soft and would not hold a stampede. The colonel did not take a foreman's word over his own impatience. Not that year, not with a buyer waiting in San Antonio and money on the line. Emmett rode the crossing anyway, because that was the job, and because the colonel's own son, young Wyatt Vance, 22 years old and reckless in the particular way of sons who had never once in their life heard the word no, rode point himself that morning to prove he did not need Emmett's caution. The shelf gave. The herd panicked. Wyatt's horse went down in the churn of ice and hooves and did not come back up, and neither, in the end, did Wyatt. The colonel needed, in the black weeks that followed, someone to have done this to him, because the alternative, that his own stubbornness had killed his only son, was a thing Ezra Vance could not carry, and would not carry, not for one single hour. His segundo, a hard, quiet man named Cole Dreyer, who had never liked Emmett and liked him less for outranking him, found a torn latigo strap among the wreckage on the bank, and swore before a coroner's inquest that lasted less than an afternoon that he had seen Emmett cut it himself. That Emmett had meant for Wyatt to go down in that crossing out of some grudge no one troubled to explain. It was a lie built whole from a grieving man's need and a jealous man's opportunity, and it worked exactly as such lies do. A warrant went out for Emmett Shaw on a charge of murder before the ice had even finished melting off that river. He had one night's warning from a stable boy who owed him a kindness, one horse and the clothes on his back, and he rode north with nothing else to his name and a bounty on his head that grew larger every month. The colonel's grief curdled further into rage. He crossed 4 territories in 11 months under names that were not his own, and every one of them cost him something, a little more of the man he had been before Willow Ford, until there was not much left of Emmett Shaw but the habit of looking over his shoulder and the stubborn refusal to lie down and let the lie finish him. He had heard from a drifter in a Cheyenne bunkhouse of a women's correspondence service that placed lonely men in the territories with women looking to start fresh out west. A man's past his own business so long as he could work and would treat a woman kindly. Emmett had not written the letter himself. He had in fact never written any letter at all, a fact that would matter a great deal later, though he did not know it yet, standing on a train platform in Cheyenne with a listing in his coat pocket that bore his name over a description he'd never given anyone, and a Wyoming address he had never in his life laid eyes on. Opal Mabry had written that listing herself the same way a meddling woman in an old frontier tale once wrote a letter she had no earthly right to write, and Opal did it, for reasons of her own that had nothing to do with meddling and everything to do with love, though she would have gone to her grave denying she meddled at all. She had watched Birdie Calloway grow thinner and harder and quieter every season since Daniel died, watched the girl she remembered dancing at her own wedding disappear a little more each winter into a woman made entirely of work, and Opal had decided, quietly and without permission, that this particular trouble needed a particular kind of remedy. She placed the listing under Birdie's name, and the Anvil Creek address described her honestly, which is to say, formidably, and did not breathe a word of it to Birdie herself. 3 replies came back over 2 months. 2 felt uncertain, hedging the kind of letters a woman reads and sets down without finishing twice. The 3rd was short, plain, and carried something underneath the plain words that Opal recognized at once. A man trying very hard not to sound as desperate as he was. She wrote back within the week informing Emmett Shaw only that a widow on Anvil Creek needed a good hand and had no patience for foolishness. She left Birdie in the dark entirely, trusting, the way meddling women always trust, that 2 broken people given half a chance might do the rest of the work themselves. The letter reached Birdie on a Tuesday in late November, delivered by Ezekiel Combs with his hat already off, which warned her before she'd even read a word that something had gone sideways. She read Opal's forwarded correspondence twice through, standing at her own kitchen table with her jaw setting harder with every line, and by the second reading, she had already worked out exactly whose handiwork this was. There was only one name for it, and it was Opal Mabry. Underneath the fury, though, something else was stirring that Birdie did not have a name for yet and did not care to go looking for one. She rode down to the Mercantile inside the hour and gave Opal a piece of her mind that left the older woman entirely unrepentant. "You're disappearing up there, Beatrice," Opal warned her, plain as the flower on her own apron, "and I would rather you be furious with me alive than agreeable with me buried." Birdie did not have an answer for that. She rode home instead, and did not write the man back to warn him off, though for 3 days running she kept meaning to. She did not have to write him after all, because Emmett Shaw came up that mountain road on foot the last 2 miles, his horse having gone lame at the base of the pass, on a gray, hard afternoon with the first real snow of the season already falling. And that is how a widow with a rifle across her arm and a stranger's letter still unanswered in her coat pocket came to find a haunted, hollowed-out man standing at the bottom of her porch steps, asking, in a voice worn down to almost nothing, whether this was the Calloway place. I never sent for anything. It was true, and it was also, in its way, the first honest thing either of them had put into words, and it was in the silence after, with the snow coming down harder and the light going out of the sky, that Birdie made the decision that would cost her a good deal more sleep than she expected. She did not send him back down the mountain, not with his horse lame, and the pass closing behind him, and dusk coming on fast enough to kill a man who tried the trail in the dark. He could bunk in the line shack by the barn, she informed him, and she'd feed him through the storm, and he'd earn that feeding, same as any hand on her outfit. And if he tried one single thing out of line, she'd put a bullet through something he'd miss a great deal more than his pride. "Yes, ma'am," was all Emmett Shaw managed, and he meant every word of it, and that was the whole of their wedding night. 3 empty years before either of them would have named it that. A line shack, a blizzard, and a woman's word that she'd shoot him if he crossed it. The first weeks were work, mostly, and work suited them both because it let them be near each other without the burden of pretending to know what to say. Emmett mended fence in weather that would have sent a lesser hand back to Texas, and he did it without complaint. And Birdie noticed, the way she noticed everything on her own land, that he had a gift with her spookiest gelding, the one that had thrown 3 men that summer, and that the horse went quiet and easy under his hands inside of a week. She noticed, too, the way he never once let his eyes linger too long or his hands stray too near, the way he kept a careful, respectful distance even when the wort put them shoulder to shoulder in the same stall, and something in her, some old caution 3 winters deep, began very slowly to loosen. She fed him at her own table because it was foolish not to, and their meals were quiet the way 2 careful people's meals are quiet, not unfriendly, just weighted with things neither one had put into words yet. He fixed the hinge on her henhouse door that had squealed since before Daniel died, without her ever asking him to, and left it be without mentioning it, and she found it fixed 3 days later, and stood there a long while, with her hand on the new hinge before she went back inside. She started leaving coffee on the stove an hour before he'd wake for chores, which was not a thing she had ever troubled to do for a hired hand in her life. Neither one of them named any of it courting. Neither one of them would have survived saying the word out loud. It was on the 6th evening, with the wind howling low around the eaves and the fire burned down to embers, that Birdie finally put to him the question she had been chewing on since he arrived. "You didn't write that letter." It wasn't a question so much as a fact laid down on the table between them, and she watched him go very still. "No, ma'am," Emmett managed. "I never wrote a word to anybody in Wyoming. Somebody wrote it in my name, and I expect I know why, though I didn't figure it out till I was 3 states north and couldn't turn back. And then, because a woman who has fed a man, mended alongside him, and kept his secret shelter through a blizzard, has earned more than half-truths, he laid out the whole of it for her. Willow Ford, and the boy who went under the ice, and the torn strap that was never his doing, and Coal Dryer's lie, and the Colonel's grief turned to hunting. And a young wrangler named Charlie Ruiz, who had been riding drag that day, and had seen the whole crossing from the near bank, close enough to know exactly whose word had cut that strap and whose had not, and who had vanished from the Vance outfit inside a month, too frightened of the Colonel's reach to ever put what he'd seen into words out loud. Birdie listened without interrupting, the way she listened to a spooked animal, letting the whole story run itself out before she moved a muscle, and when he finished, she did not flinch away from him, and she did not reach for the rifle above her own door, which Emmett had half expected she might. What came out of her instead was, "Then somebody ought to go find that boy." Emmett protested that it wasn't her fight, that a man like Ezra Vance had money enough to buy every sheriff between here and San Antonio, and would not think twice about burning her outfit to the ground for sheltering him. Birdie looked at him a long moment across the dying fire, and gave him the very word she would use again, louder, on a much harder day still to come. "This is my mountain, Mr. Shaw. I decide what's my fight and what isn't, and I have decided." He did not argue with her again. Few men who knew her ever did. Twice, word that a bounty man was asking questions in the valley reached Anvil Creek by way of Ezekiel Combs on a Thursday 3 weeks later, and it came with a name attached that made Emmett's face go the color of old ash. Coal Dryer had ridden into the township below, quiet and thorough, asking after a tall, dark-haired stranger who might have come through in the last season, offering money for information, and letting it be known, in the careful way such men always let such things be known, that his employer was not far behind him and was not a patient man. Birdie rode down to the Mercantile herself that same afternoon, ostensibly for flour, and came back with considerably more than flour. Opal Mowbray, feeling the particular guilt of a woman whose meddling had grown teeth, had already sent word up the valley to every rancher who owed the Calloway name a favor, which, given 3 generations of Calloway generosity in that township, amounted to nearly the whole valley. The Colonel came up the mountain road himself 6 days later, on a morning with the sky sitting low and gray, and the first hard snow of the season not yet melted off the north slopes, and he came the way a wealthy man always comes to collect a debt he considers already settled in his own mind, straight-backed, unhurried, certain. Coal Dryer rode at his left, and 2 hired guns rode behind, and the 4 of them came up Birdie Calloway's road with the particular deliberate pace of men who believed the outcome was not actually in question. But Birdie Calloway had grown up on that mountain, had run cattle across every foot of it since before she could properly spell her own name, and she had spent the 6 days, since Dryer's first questions, doing considerably more than baking. She had ridden the length of Anvil Creek twice over, studying the ground the way she studied a coming storm, and she had settled on the narrow cattle chute below the North Corral, a stretch of trail pinched tight between a granite shelf and a drop no rider in his right mind would risk in snow, as the one piece of her land where 4 armed men on horseback would be forced, whether they liked it or not, to come through single file and slow. She had sent Ezekiel and 2 neighboring hands to wait hidden along that shelf with rifles, They would not need to fire so long as everyone kept their heads, and she had sent her fastest rider down to the township depot 3 days prior with a telegraph message and every dollar of coffee tin savings she had. Addressed to a stage agent in Cheyenne who owed her father an old debt, asking him to find one Charlie Ruiz, wherever the frightened boy had gotten himself to, and put him on the first coach north with whatever the truth was worth to him. The stage came in at dawn that very morning, later than she'd have liked, but not too late, and it carried a thin, nervous young man of 23 who had spent 2 years running from Ezra Vance's reach almost as hard as Emmett had, and who, once Birdie sat him down at her own kitchen table and assured him plainly that the man he'd have to look in the eye that day had never once hurt him and never would, agreed, with hands that shook only a little, to put his account on paper and sign it before a county man Birdie had also sent for. A deputy from the valley below who owed the Calloway name a debt of his own from a hard winter years back, and who arrived, quiet and unannounced, an hour before the colonel did, and took up a position in Birdie's own barn, where he could see the whole yard and hear every word spoken in it. So when Ezra Vance rode into the yard at Anvil Creek that gray morning, he rode into a stretch of open ground, with a chute at his back too narrow to retreat through fast, a widow standing on her own porch with a rifle broken open across one arm, exactly as she had stood the first day Emmett Shaw came up her road. 3 armed neighbors he could not see. Tucked along the granite shelf behind him, a county deputy watching from her barn, and a frightened, furious young wrangler standing just inside her kitchen door, with a signed affidavit in his coat pocket that the colonel did not yet know existed. "I've no business with you, ma'am," the colonel said, looking down at her from the saddle with the particular flat courtesy of a man who has never once in his life been made to feel small. "I'm here for the man hiding on your land. Send him out, and my business here is finished. If you want to stand with this channel, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member. Every one of you keeps the fire lit. There's no murderer hiding on my land, Colonel." Birdie's voice did not so much as waver. "Though I hear there's one still walking free down in Texas, and I expect he sleeps in your own house most nights." The colonel's face went the color of the granite behind him. Cole Dryer's hand drifted, slow and deliberate, toward the pistol at his hip, and it was in that half-second, with the yard gone dead silent, and the snow beginning to fall soft and thick again, that Birdie Calloway stepped down off her own porch, walked straight across her own yard, and took hold of Cole Dryer's bridle with one hand, while the other brought her rifle up, level with his chest close enough that he could feel the cold of the barrel through his coat. "You reach for that iron on my land," Birdie warned, "and you will not live to spend whatever the colonel's paying you." Dryer's hand went still. Behind the colonel, up on the granite shelf, 3 rifles she had placed there 6 days earlier made themselves known all at once, catching the gray morning light, and the 2 hired guns at the rear of the colonel's party looked at each other and made the same calculation men in that position generally make. It was Emmett who stepped out onto the porch then unarmed, his hands open at his sides, and it was Charlie Ruiz who stepped out just behind him, and the colonel's eyes went from one to the other with an expression that had nothing left of certainty in it. "You know this boy, Colonel," Birdie said, still holding Dryer's bridle, still steady as stone. "He's got a signed statement in his pocket about what happened at Willow Ford, and a county deputy standing in my barn who's already read it and is fixing to write it down to the circuit judge himself, along with word of what 4 armed men did on a widow's land today. So, you can ride back down this mountain the way you came, Colonel Vance, and let a grieving man's mistake stay a mistake. Or you can make it a great deal worse for yourself, right here in front of my whole valley's neighbors, who I promise you are watching from that tree line same as I am." The colonel sat his horse a long moment, snow gathering on his shoulders, looking at the young wrangler he'd spent 2 years hunting, almost as hard as he'd hunted Emmett, looking at the deputy stepping out from the barn with the affidavit, already waiting in his outstretched hand, looking at the widow who had somehow turned his own collection into a trap, sprung as clean as any he'd ever laid himself. Something in his face gave way then, Not remorse, not exactly, but the particular recognition of a man who has finally, completely, run out of road. He looked once more at Emmett Shaw, standing steady on that porch beside the woman who'd sheltered him, and he had no answer left in him at all. He turned his horse. Cold Dryer, released at last from Birdie's grip on his bridle, followed him without a word, and the 2 hired guns fell in behind, and the 4 of them rode back down off Anvil Creek the way they'd come, smaller, somehow, than when they'd arrived, and did not look back. The snow kept falling long after the sound of their horses had gone. It came down soft and steady over the yard, over the chute where 3 neighbors climbed down off the granite shelf with their rifles finally lowered, over the young wrangler standing in the doorway with tears freezing on his face, because he had finally let the true thing out after 2 years of choking on it, over the deputy folding that signed affidavit carefully into his coat to carry down to the circuit judge himself. Birdie stood in the middle of her own yard and let it fall on her too, and it was Emmett who crossed to her first, moving slow, the way a man moves toward something he is still not entirely sure he is allowed to want. You didn't have to do any of that. It was the very thing a stranger had once spoken to a mountain man, in a story Birdie herself would never hear, though the words landed the same wherever they were spoken. "Yes," Birdie said, "I did." And she looked at him standing there in the snow, hollowed out from 2 years of running, and looking for the first time since he'd climbed her porch steps, half frozen and half drowned in somebody else's lie, like a man who believed he might actually get to stop. She thought of Daniel, then briefly, the way she still did most days, and found that the thought did not carry the same hollow weight it usually did, standing there with snow settling on both their shoulders. She had not gone looking for a husband. She had not sought a single thing from Opal Mabry. She had built her whole life these 3 winters on the conviction that she did not need anybody's help to keep her mountain, and she had been right about that, every single day of it. What she had never once expected was that keeping her mountain and choosing to share it were not, in the end, the same question at all. Emmett took her hand there in the yard, snow gathering on both their sleeves, and she let him, and neither one of them voiced the word love out loud that day, because 3 winters of carrying things alone and 11 months of running from a lie do not disappear inside one gray afternoon, no matter how it ends. But she did not pull her hand back either, and that, between 2 people built the way Birdie Calloway and Emmett Shaw were built, was its own kind of vow. Charlie Ruiz's sign statement reached the circuit judge inside the week, and word came back before the last hard snow of that winter had melted that the charge against Emmett Shaw had been struck from every book it was ever written in. That Ezra Vance's own Segundo had quietly left Texas for parts unknown rather than answer questions about a torn latigo strap, and that the colonel himself, having lost a son to his own stubbornness and very nearly lost everything else besides on a Wyoming widow's land. Emmett stayed on at Anvil Creek clear through spring branding, and clear through the summer after that, and by the following autumn, Opal Mabry finally got to stand up in the little valley church and watch the wedding she'd been meddling toward for the better part of a year, and she cried through the whole of it. Birdie Calloway kept her mountain. That much never changed, not for any man, not even the one she chose to keep it with. But she was not alone on it anymore, and there is a particular kind of quiet, she found, that only comes when a woman finally stops bracing herself against an empty house. Somewhere down in the valley, Opal Mabry likely sat behind her own counter some evening, not long after, smiling to herself at nothing in particular, the way meddling women do when a thing they had no business arranging turns out against every reasonable odd. Exactly right. And that, my friends, is the story of Beatrice Calloway and Emmett Shaw. 2 people who never once went looking for each other, brought together by a listing neither of them had requested, and a mountain that would not let either one of them stay broken. She had spent 3 winters believing that strength meant carrying everything herself. He had spent 11 months believing that running was the only way to survive, a lie built to bury him. Neither of them found what they needed by asking for it. Sometimes I think the things we most need are exactly the things we would never think to ask for at all. And sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is not run from what's hers, but stand on it, rifle broken open, and dare the whole world to try and take it from her. If a story like this one feels like home to you, come sit by this fire a while longer, because there's always another one waiting up the trail. I'm so glad you rode along with me today, and I'll see you back here again soon, right here where the cowgirls always get to be the ones who stay.